Let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this last session. So we'll start with a short meditation again and reflect on some of these ways of dealing with anger that we looked at in the last session. So if we can really reflect on these ideas and internalize them, then we can start to implement them in our life. And then a short review of some of the points from last session. And they often say prevention is the best cure. So we'll then look at actually a couple of ways of actually preventing anger in the first place. And then I want to look at overcoming low self-esteem. I think that's a big topic in the modern world. Seems like there's a big epidemic of low self-esteem and self-hatred in the modern world. And we'll look at some ways of how to deal with that and overcome it. And then a short preview of what we're going to be covering tomorrow. But let's start with the meditation. Just reflecting on some ways of dealing with anger to really start to internalize these ideas. We begin as always with settling into a nice, comfortable posture. And allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed. And allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And allowing the mind to come to rest. To come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. So let's now reflect on some ways of dealing with anger. So remember, anger is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive. It exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and thus wishes to harm the object. Why? Because anger believes that object is the source of our suffering. And when we look at ways of dealing with anger, we're not trying to suppress the anger, but rather try to look at the situation in a different way so that the anger simply dissolves. So first bring to mind a situation where you got angry or frustrated when something didn't work out the way you wanted it to. And try to picture that very clearly. And then ask yourself, could I have done something about that situation? And if there's something we can do regarding a situation to change it, then there's no need to get angry. Simply make the change. And if there's nothing we can do to change the situation, then what's the use in getting angry? It doesn't help. Now think of a situation where you got angry when someone else criticized you. Again, try to picture that very clearly. And then ask yourself, was their criticism valid? If what they said was true, why get angry? Because they're giving us the opportunity to correct our faults and to improve ourselves. And if what they said was untrue, since they're completely mistaken, we can simply ignore what they're saying. And regardless of whether their criticism was valid or not, they're providing us the opportunity to develop the quality of patience. So in fact, they're being very kind to us. We can benefit from this difficult situation in this way. And now think of a situation where you got angry in a conflict with another person. And now, instead of looking at the situation from your own perspective, assume the perspective of the other person. Try to imagine how the situation would look to them. When we try to understand their viewpoint, we can see that they're just like us, wanting to be happy and wanting to be free of suffering. And that due to their confusion and mental afflictions, they're just creating suffering for themselves and for the people around them. And so in this way, by distinguishing the person and their behavior, we can begin to cultivate compassion for the person. And if their behavior is inappropriate, we can address their bad behavior without attacking the person. Now think of a situation where you got irritated or frustrated. And allow some irritation or frustration to arise. Now, instead of focusing on the situation, look directly at your irritation and frustration. Don't try to push it away. Just look at it directly. What is the nature of this irritation or frustration? Is it something solid and concrete, or does it change? And if we look directly at the irritation or frustration in this way, does it have any power over us? Do we need to fight with it? Or does it simply begin to dissolve? Now think of a person who makes you angry or irritated. And picture this person very clearly in front of you. And then mentally dissect this person and search for what exactly is it that makes you angry or irritated. Perhaps it's something they said. If so, words are just sounds. So which sound is irritating? Or perhaps it's something that they did. Actions are just movements of the body. So which particular movement is irritating or makes you angry? Or perhaps it's simply their appearance that irritates you or makes you angry. If so, appearances are just colours and shapes. So which colour or shape makes you angry or is irritated? And so by reflecting in this way, we can see how our mind creates the irritating or annoying person by interpreting the situation in a certain way and then applying a label such as annoying or irritating. And then we go on to mistake our concept of the person for the person themselves. We then see them as inherently or objectively irritating. And so in conclusion, recognize that by engaging in these reflections repeatedly and applying them to situations in our life, we can clear up a lot of anger and frustration. And we can develop a more healthy way of looking at things and make a strong determination to do so. And then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest. And we can bring the meditation to a close and continue our discussions here this afternoon. In the last session, we looked at anger, defined it, and dispelled some misconceptions. So again, here we see that anger not only has this factor of exaggeration or distortion, but this intention to harm. And here again, we need to be careful how we use this word, because often in other contexts, as we saw from this example I raised about the psychologist, anger is used in a different way, often to mean just really forceful, strong words and behavior. But again, I think Buddhism's not really focused so much on the surface level words and actions and behavior, but what's driving that. And so therefore, when we use the word anger here, we're talking about this intention to harm. And I think this is never okay. And again, where does anger come from? Is this distorted view of reality, because it seems like when we encounter unpleasant people or things, that's the cause of my suffering, and we have this aversion, and then that can get magnified to this anger, wishing to harm, wishing to get this person or thing out of our life, because it seems to be the source of our suffering. And then we saw that dispelling some misconceptions that, hopefully it's true that we don't particularly like to have an intention to harm our friends, at least. But here, we're talking about anger, not the person. So even though we as a person may not ever wish to harm our friends, sometimes if anger takes control, then anger does, and therefore we end up saying and do things that we later regret. So again, we need to distinguish between person and anger. And we saw here that we can, sometimes in difficult situations, we need to be forceful. But we don't need to resort to anger, because anger, and we know this from our own experience, when we're very strong anger, we often overreact and inappropriately and just make a bigger mess. So rather, to be patient means to have a calm mind, evaluate the situation, and if necessary, we can use compassion as the strong force, because the compassion is the wish for them to be free of suffering and the cause of suffering. So if this person is behaving badly, with a strong motivation of wishing to help them, we can address their negative behavior, and if necessary, even use physical force to restrain that person with compassion. And then we saw this idea of cognitive fusion, that when someone's behaving badly, the correct perspective again is there is a person engaging in a harmful behavior. But we often have this perspective simply, there is a bad person. So what we've done there is we've just fused the person and behavior together and made them one thing. In psychology, this is called cognitive fusion. And again, it's a false, invalid perspective, because there are two things here, person and behavior, not one thing. But if we do this cognitive fusion, as I mentioned, we're in trouble, because in any given situation, we've got two choices, accept or reject. And generally, if someone's behaving badly, we reject the behavior. But if we've glued the behavior to the person, that rejection gets directed at the person, we get angry, we attack the person. And if we understand that attacking the person is not helpful, the only other option is accept. And if we want to accept the person, but we've glued the behavior to the person, that acceptance also means we end up accepting bad behavior, also not good. And then we end up judging, condemning the person. Compassion becomes almost impossible, because we're directing compassion to the person, but because we've glued the behavior to the person, it seems like we are somehow accepting their negative behavior through compassion. And so we feel like, no, they don't deserve it because they're just such a horrible, bad, nasty person. And then we end up with a fixed, biased view of the person. And then we get into this conflict of us versus them. I'm one of the good people. They're the bad people. Let's get rid of those bad people. So the answer to this is avoid cognitive fusion, because it's a false, invalid perspective. Simply acknowledge there is a person engaging in harmful behavior. Then we can accept the person, have compassion for the person, and at the same time reject their negative behavior and help them to overcome their negative behavior. And then we saw that in terms of dealing with anger, the first step is to have a clear understanding of what we mean by anger and how it just leads to suffering, to develop the aspiration to be free of it. And then one of the key elements to be able to deal with anger as it's arising is mindfulness. Because without mindfulness, we are only going to notice anger when it's already taken control of our mind. Then there's very little we can do. About the only thing we can do then is get out of that situation quickly before we say and do things we're going to regret. The key is to catch that little window of opportunity from when it first arises until it takes control of our mind. To be able to catch that window, we need mindfulness. With mindfulness, we can see that anger much earlier as it's arising, then simply observe it. And if we observe it, we're free of it. It can't go anywhere. We're not feeding it. It has no power over us. It will simply dissolve, dissipate. We don't need to fight with it or try to suppress it. But again, we need to cultivate mindfulness to be able to do that. Otherwise, we're just going to be a stimulus reaction machine, reacting out of habit. And then we can also, what's called apply antidotes, again, develop this quality of patience, an undisturbed, calm mind. Because again, we saw there that if we're caught up in lots of distractions, then we're more prone to mental afflictions arising in our mind. And then the idea of emptiness, which we'll talk more about tomorrow. And then again, very helpful to avoid this cognitive fusion, not identifying with our anger, because if we simply acknowledge or see or think, I'm angry, what you've done is you've identified with anger. You've basically said, there you go, anger, you're the boss, away you go. So the more we can step back, instead of I am angry, I feel angry, already a little bit of distance. Even better, I am experiencing anger. Even better, leave out the I, because then there's less likely to do cognitive, just anger is arising in the mind. Even better. So again, practicing these sorts of methods in meditation and then applying them in daily life. Now, prevention is the best cure. How can we prevent anger? So here earlier, we looked at these 6 factors. The first 3 are necessary for anger to arise, and the other 3 are contributing, make it more easy for anger to arise. So seed is the habit of anger. So to prevent anger long term, to completely overcome anger, we need to eliminate the seed. And that's going to be done through this wisdom practice of emptiness, which we're going to look at tomorrow afternoon. So that's the long-term strategy. Short-term, as we've seen, one necessary factor again is object. So again, in the short term, if there are objects, and that can be situations, things, or people that always overwhelm us, we always react in an angry way, then as an effective short-term strategy, step back from that. Give yourself some space. Of course, we're not saying running away is a long-term solution. It never is. But if we can step back from these strong objects that always overwhelm us, to develop ourselves so that later we can enter into these more difficult situations without getting overwhelmed. And then we have to have this inappropriate attention. And we saw here that anger has this effect of exaggeration of faults. So if we are coming into a situation where we are starting to get into anger, we can then notice how our mind is exaggerating the faults or the ugliness in that object itself. And that can help to prevent anger arising. And we'll speak more about that also tomorrow. And then contributing conditions, again, how to help prevent anger is, in terms of familiarity, not allowing it to simply continue when it's there, to cut it short so that we don't strengthen the seed. So then in future, it's harder for it to come up because it's weaker. And then again, the same thing with the society and media. If there are certain people or certain things in the media that really overwhelm us, cause a lot of anger, step back in the short term to develop ourselves, then we can go into that. So these are a few of the things we can do in the short term to prevent anger. The long-term preventing anger, of course, is to eliminate the seed of anger through the wisdom practice of emptiness. So again, summarizing some of those points, preventing anger, again, avoid overwhelming situations, step back, notice the exaggeration of faults, cultivating that mindfulness, because again, if we have a distracted mind, we're more easily to get caught up in anger and other things as well. And then the longer term is cultivating this view of genuine happiness, to really start to see difficult situations not as problems or obstacles, but as opportunities. Because if we can start to make that shift, what you will find is that by seeing difficult situations as opportunities, that's going to stop the aversion, which is going to lead maybe to anger, and we'll be able to use that difficult situation as fuel for the spiritual path. And then we'll actually be happy that we have some challenges in our life to help us to develop as a person, rather than getting angry, thinking this is a problem, an obstacle, it's just causing me suffering. So this shift of perspective I think is going to be very, very helpful for starting to prevent anger from arising in the first place. Then that brings us to the next topic, overcoming low self-esteem. So in the modern world, there really seems to be this epidemic of low self-esteem and self-hatred. Where does this come from? I think it comes from two things. Our old friend cognitive fusion, plus we have this obsessive focus on the negative in the modern world. I mean, obsessive. All the news and all the media, it's all negative, negative. In fact, they did this study a while ago, and it was one city in the US, they asked people whether in the last, 5 or 10 years it was, I can't remember, 5 or 10 years, whether things like murder, robbery, crime, all of these things, whether in the last 5 or 10 years has that increased, stayed the same, or decreased. And the overwhelming response was it had increased. Where actually statistically in all those areas it had decreased. The reason they felt it was increasing is because that's all they saw in the media. They just saw robbery, violence, killing, everything. So it must be increasing because that's what we see. And same with us. I mean, how often, we have a day where maybe 95% of the things we did were quite good, helping people, 5% not so good, and we did a few little things we're not happy with. At the end of the day, oh, such a horrible person today, so bad person today. I mean, it's because we have this obsessive focus on the negative. And our modern society is really pushing that agenda. So 2 things here, how to overcome low self-esteem and self-hatred is have a balanced view of ourselves, not just focusing on the negative, and we'll talk more about that shortly, and then avoid this cognitive fusion. Because again, often, if we've done a harmful, unskillful action, the proper perspective is, I have done this harmful action or bad behavior, correct perspective. But rather, instead of that, we say, I'm a bad person, I'm a horrible person, nasty person, cognitive fusion. And again, if we do this, and we do this a lot, 2 choices, accept, reject. And of course, bad behavior, we reject, but we've fused it to ourselves, so the rejection gets aimed at ourselves. We attack ourselves. We reject, we criticize, we judge. This is all cognitive fusion. We condemn ourselves, and we have self-hatred because I'm just such a horrible, bad person. And this is where guilt comes from. Guilt comes from cognitive fusion. Because if we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me, bad me. So guilt, we don't need to feel guilty about anything because it's coming from a false, invalid perspective. And all that guilt does is it paralyzes us and makes us feel bad. It does not even address the negative behavior. So it's completely useless as well, apart from paralyzing us. It doesn't help as well. And then, of course, if we do the cognitive fusion I'm a bad person, then we end up with a fixed biased view of ourselves. I'm just a bad person. I'm a horrible person, nasty person. And that's, of course, low self-esteem. Even though maybe 95% of the things we do are good, but we focus on the 5% with cognitive fusion, and then we come out, I am a bad person. That's me. Of course, the solution to all of this is don't do cognitive fusion because it's a false, invalid perspective. Rather, acknowledge I have done a negative behavior, then we can accept ourselves and reject our negative behavior. And this is the difference between regret and guilt. Again, if we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me. If we feel regret, what are we focusing on? The action. I regret having done this action. So regret is coming from a valid perspective, and therefore regret can help us. It is addressing the negative behavior. We can overcome the negative behavior through the regret. And then we can accept ourselves. We can have forgiveness and compassion, because if we do the cognitive fusion, how often do we say, people say to themselves, I don't deserve forgiveness or compassion because I'm just such a horrible, nasty, mean, bad person. So no such thing as a bad person. There's only people who sometimes do bad behavior, and we all sometimes do good things, sometimes do bad things. So then we can accept ourselves, we can have compassion for ourselves, forgive ourselves, and at the same time not tolerate our negative behavior, address our negative behavior, regret it, and work to overcome it. And then we can have a balanced view of ourselves. We can have good self-esteem and at the same time not tolerate our negative behavior and work to overcome it. Now, unfortunately, and it's understood, I think, that in the modern world we have this huge epidemic of low self-esteem, but unfortunately some therapies only address half the issue. That is, address the issue of focusing on the good things, but they don't fail to address the issue of cognitive fusion. So in some therapies, they say, okay, to overcome your low self-esteem, instead of thinking I'm a bad person, think I'm a good person. I'm a good person. Well, you're focusing on the good, but with cognitive fusion, and that'll just end up with lots of other problems. Because if you do that, there's a danger of cognitive fusion, and then it becomes a bit of an ego trip. I'm not only a good person, I'm a special person. And then it becomes very difficult to acknowledge our negative behavior because I'm a good person and good people don't do bad things. So we sort of tend to ignore and not address our negative behavior because I'm a good person. And then of course it's us versus them. I'm a good person, bad people, let's get rid of them. We're the good people. And then of course at some point we understand this idea I'm a good person doesn't stack up because we see we're actually doing some negative things. And then it'll just confirm to us, actually, I'm not a good person, I'm really a bad person. And then we just flip to the other extreme. So this, not a good idea. So yes, we want to focus on the good, but not with cognitive fusion. So therefore, focus on the positives, but not with cognitive fusion. So if we do some good action, then we need to praise the action, not the person. Don't go, I'm a great person. It's not going to end well. So rather, praise our behavior. So again, even to avoid cognitive fusion, instead of saying or thinking, I did this good thing, because even when we think that, because we do cognitive fusion, that probably translates into our mind, oh, actually, I'm a good person. Rather, just think, that's such a wonderful, good behavior to do. Just focus on the activity, leave out the agent. And there's less likely to do this cognitive fusion. So what we can see here is that in this case, or in earlier, we are doing this cognitive fusion with respect to our anger or our mental afflictions in general. But we not only do that, we fuse ourselves with lots of other things as well. Often we fuse ourselves with our thoughts. We think we're a certain type of person because we think in a certain way. Or again, we fuse with our emotions. We fuse with our memories. We often have certain memories, and that's what we identify with, and that's who we are, and then we get stuck there. And then, of course, We fuse with our habits, I'm an angry person, that's me, you better accept that because that's me. And we even fuse with our personality. I'm such and such a personality. So this is all cognitive fusion. So we are none of these things. Either we are these things or we have these things. We can't be both. So either we are our thoughts and emotions and memories and habits and behavior, personality, or we have thoughts, emotions, memories, habits, personality, and so forth. So we have all these things. So if we avoid cognitive fusion, we're going to avoid a lot of unnecessary suffering. Any questions on that?
Yeah, my question is, I think when I'm exploring these concepts, I feel like fundamentally my thoughts are becoming more absolute, like this is wrong, this is right. Let's say stealing is wrong, stealing is right, right? And then when I interact with people in my life, I feel I have a cognitive fusion, and so do they, right? I feel mine has become more righteous, like let's not do this, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I feel I'm in a space where I'm not a bad person, and I'm also not like I'm somewhere in the middle of these two
Sure.
situations.
Yeah.
And I feel like, of course, I cannot see it for myself, but I can see it for the other person, that they feel fidgety, and they want to accept but they can't, they can't accept that, okay, I have this. So I always wonder if I should say something, but then I wonder, like, it's a projection of my own cognitive fusion, like we are at the same level, just differently.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So I go silent
Yeah.
sometimes.
So this is a good question. I think in general, the question is, as we come to understand some of these concepts and start to sort of follow a little bit of a spiritual path, we can not only start to see various processes within ourselves better, but it becomes more evident in others. So the question is how to help others. Well, before that, before addressing that, one point is that when we're trying to follow a more meaningful path in our life, a spiritual path, and certainly sort of from a Buddhist perspective, what we're trying to do is, depends how you use the word ego, but in some ways we can say we're trying to like transcend the ego, depending on how you understand the word ego, of course. But of course the ego doesn't want to die. So what often happens is once we start to develop these concepts and ideas and so forth, the ego grabs hold of that and sort of takes over. And then we become what's called a spiritual ego. One of the worst. One of the worst, because spiritual ego has this sense of superiority. I'm better than everyone else. In fact, I'm so spiritual, you need to do what I tell you to do because I know better than you. So if this comes in, then the ego has hijacked our practice. So we really need to try to avoid that. In fact, there's a very nice saying in Tibetan, I don't know if it comes in Tibetan Buddhism, but I think in Tibetan culture, it says something like, the harvest of good qualities does not grow on the rocky peaks of pride. It grows in the low, fertile valleys of humility. So if we are trying to follow a spiritual path and somehow we're getting like, look at me, then egos, we need to work to reduce that, because we're going completely astray, because the ego is just taking control of our spiritual path, and then actually we become quite obnoxious, especially to others, because they go, who are you? Go away. So we need to avoid that. In fact, what you find, people who are really genuinely following the spiritual path and developing a lot of qualities, one quality that people really develop a lot as they go deeper into the path is humility. Humility. So if you see someone in public who claims to be quite advanced on the spiritual path, but they're sort of walking around like, I'm the best sort of thing, and that's what they're sort of saying, and run away. because they're just delusional. The ego's taking control. And often these people not only want to be seen to be that, they often manipulate others, try and control others. So these people you just want to run away from. So that's one point from our own side, is that just be mindful of that. Is if we're somehow coming across as superior, we need to work on that, and to reduce that, because our practice has gone astray. It's being grabbed by the ego. And then in terms of actually helping others, yes, I mean, once we start to understand these various processes in our own mind and how they lead to suffering and so forth, it becomes more and more evident how other people, through their processes, are suffering. So how to help them. There's no book you can go to that says do this, because every situation is unique. So all we can do is evaluate every situation on its own merit and decide how best to respond. And the two main factors we can use to help us evaluate is wisdom and compassion. Is with a compassionate motivation of wishing to really help them overcome suffering, and not like I know best for you. And then the wisdom, knowing, well, what can I do to help this person? Then we respond. And some situations, wisdom says, well, actually, this person is so close-minded that whatever I say, they're just going to reject it. So then if you try and push something onto them, then you've probably lost any chance of being able to help them, because they'll shut the door forever, probably, or for a long time. So we need to try to work out, well, is this person going to be receptive to something I suggest or not? And unfortunately, it's often the case that it's, like family members, particularly more elder, maybe parents or something, who are quite set in their ways. It's very difficult because they don't like to be challenged in their ways. And so then wisdom might say, okay, whatever I say, they're just going to shut the door. So then we can say, well, the one thing we can do is lead by example, is just develop ourselves. And then over time, they may see, wow, this person's really becoming more patient and kind and so forth. What are you doing? And then you've got a chance to help. So sometimes you can't do anything. And of course, we can't change people. If we think we can change, we can't. All we can do is be a positive condition or example for people, condition for people. And then, of course, if they're open, then we can explain some things that they may find useful. And then, of course, if we have the idea that I'm not going to tell them anything unless I know 100% that's the right thing to tell them, we'll never do anything. Because we're never going to know 100% whether that's the right thing to do or not. Otherwise, we will never respond, because we won't know 100%. All we can do is, as much compassion as wisdom we have, and we believe this is the right response, then we respond. And of course, sometimes we'll make mistakes. And rather than beating ourselves up, we'll just go, okay, I tried that with a good motivation, it didn't work, so next time I'm going to try something else. And we learn from those mistakes. That's all we can do. If we do that, that's as much as we can do.
I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
First one is, what is the fine line? Like, how
What
do
is
we
the
fine line? Like, how
fine
do
line?
we, distinguish between having a good self-esteem and self-cherishing? And the second one would be, okay, so we have talked about all these afflicted emotions since morning. Then we also talked about like creating a bit of space between those emotions, like not reacting and stuff like that. But also when we think about working on ourselves, like our inner being, inner state of mind, the quick example that comes to my mind is grabbing a cushion and like sit down for meditation. But sometimes meditation is like cleaning up a dirty room, right? So when we sit down for meditation, sometimes a lot of thoughts, conflicted emotions come up, and it gets a bit difficult to sit with those kind of thoughts. So what do we do in those scenarios?
Okay. Very good questions. First question about how do we know the difference between good self-esteem and self-cherishing? The word and part of the problem here is the word. Cherish. When we see the word self-cherishing, it's nothing in the Buddhist, that term in Buddhism's got nothing to do about feeling good about ourselves. And so a better word than self-cherishing is use selfishness, self-centered attitude. That's what it means. So it's not about, of course we need to look after ourselves, but that's not self-cherishing. Self-cherishing is the selfish, self-centered attitude that sees my happiness as more important than the happiness of anyone else. I'm the center of the universe. I'm more important than anyone else. So we need to look after ourselves. And this is the problem that sometimes people fall into, is they understand that, being selfish is actually, unfortunately, our modern society often promotes this idea, look after number one, this is a disaster. Because so superficially, it seems like this is our best friend bringing us happiness. But actually, it's our worst enemy, only brings suffering for ourselves and the people around us. And so then, with this selfish attitude, we need to really eliminate that 100%. And so then we need to, but the problem is that often people who want to help others, we talk about cherishing others, they wrongly think that if they do something for themselves, that's being selfish. And so we end up with burnout, because they overextend themselves. But so this is and then what happens, of course, is that people who do this, like social workers, aid workers, get burnt out through their compassionate activities. And they think, well, this compassion doesn't work because I'm just suffering. And they give up compassion. That's tragic, because compassion always works. What's not working here is a lack of wisdom. So we need to have them together. Otherwise, we'll get burnt out. We'll get overwhelmed, for sure. And so wisdom here will say, knowing what we can do to help, what we can't do to help, and the wisdom of knowing when to rest and look after ourselves. So we need to look after ourselves if we want to help others, because if we get burnt out, we're of no use to anyone else. So that's not being selfish. Well, that's, as His Holiness Dalai Lama sometimes says, this is smart selfishness, So therefore, that's the way we can, so we need to distinguish between looking after ourselves and being selfish. So again, it's our motivation. Our motivation is, if our motivation is, I'm just looking out for myself, and couldn't care less about anyone else, that will lead to selfishness. If our motivation is, I want to really help others, and to be able to do that, I need to take care of myself physically and mentally, then that's exactly what we need to do.
About the second question, like when it gets too much to sit with the conflicted.
Oh yeah, the second part. Yeah, sorry, the second part. Yeah. So that was a good question as well. If we sit down to do maybe a daily meditation practice, and our mind is really agitated and disturbed and so forth, what should we do? Again, here we need to find the sort of middle way, because we can go to an extreme. One extreme is that we just sort of sit there and let the mind just, and then of course we're actually encouraging the very thing we're trying to overcome. The other extreme is that, okay, anytime my mind is a bit agitated, I'm going to stop meditating. That's also an extreme, because, example, if in our life, every time we encounter a difficult situation, we give up, then we're never going to develop as a person. So we need to cultivate this sort of persistence, to be able to persist in difficult situations. And so then what we can do in meditation is, and I always recommend as a beginner, when we do a meditation practice, daily meditation practice, for example, is to use a timer, a little bit like what we're using here, this insight timer I'm using, to set a timer. Because if we don't, what often happens is on days we sit down and again, we're sort of agitated, whatever. We try to get into meditation for 5 or 6 minutes. We can't, we just stop. And so then we give up because it's difficult. And then we get in the habit of always giving up when things get a bit difficult. And that's not going to help us to develop. Whereas if we set a timer, then we'll persist. And on other days, if we don't set a timer, maybe it's going really well. And then what do? We just keep meditating until what? Until it's not going so well, and then we stop. And the thing we remember most is how it ended. So if we're always ending on a bad note, we'll start to associate meditation with not so good experiences. We're not going to be enthusiastic to meditate again the following day. So setting a timer can be very helpful. And what can be very helpful is, of course, when we sit down to meditate, it's always good to have a plan of what we're going to meditate on, not just sit down and see what happens. So have a plan. But on some days when things are really a big struggle, we can shift the plan. Like maybe we're going to, for example, sit down and focus on our breath for 15 minutes. But we're trying to do that and our mind is really agitated or whatever. And it's not really helping. Then what we can do is shift to watch that agitation. Because if we're trying to do this, go away agitation, we're trying to suppress it, it's just going to get worse. You know, it's like throwing petrol on the fire. So if we can't manage to just sort of let it go and come back to the breath, if it's just always there, temporarily in that session, what we can do is shift to that and use that as the object and just watch it. Watch that agitation. And then we're starting to develop the habit of being able to be sitting with it without getting caught up in it, without trying to suppress it. And then as much as we can just watch it and not get caught up in it, we're developing the habit of not getting caught up in suppressing. So we can actually use that as fuel in the spiritual path, rather than, again, it's an opportunity, not a problem. And so we can do it in that way. But what we don't want to do is every time our mind is a little agitated, just shift to that. But only in cases where it's very extreme, then we can do that. Sure. Any last questions?
We have one question. Somebody else has a question? We have a question online.
Okay.
I can relate it with this question. I have used bad behavior to Donald Trump, and I conclude he's a bad person. How should I deal with this cognitive fusion? Teacher, please explain.
Again, Trump, again, if we do cognitive fusion, what's going to happen, of course, is we're just going to get upset, get angry, and that's going to disturb our mind. And then if we wanted to somehow try to resolve that, we're probably going to end up doing some things that are not probably as bad, even maybe not worse. We attack people, and of course we see this. There's sort of the 2 sides or 3 sides, whatever, they're just pushing, getting angry at each other. I mean, that's not going to resolve anything. So again, we can just see, Trump is like everyone else. He just wants to be happy, he wants to be free of suffering. And he has, I think, some quite strong mental afflictions, and he believes that this behavior is the way to happiness. He's completely deluded. And if we can see that, then actually, when you see a person such as that, rather than getting angry and hostile, you can just have an outpouring of compassion. But again, compassion does not mean somehow we're accepting their negative behavior. We want to do whatever we can to help this person to overcome negative behavior. And then we can be a social activist. We can do all sorts of things with compassion, and maybe we can then make some positive change in the world. But if we get angry and do social activism, it's going to be a disaster, because it's just going to be fighting against each other, and then we're going to become part of the problem, not part of the solution. Can we wave a magic wand and make him somehow completely different? Probably not. But at least minimum, we can at least avoid agitating, upsetting ourselves, and then not making the problem worse. If not, if we can't somehow do a positive effect on the problem, at least we ourselves can use this as an opportunity to cultivate compassion. And yes, maybe there's very little we can do directly now to improve the situation, but I think if we really cultivate our compassion, then indirectly, the more we do that, the more we'll have a positive effect on others, and then this can grow and grow and grow, and then eventually maybe then there can be a very positive effect on the world. You know, the old saying that an ocean is started by drop, you know. So if we do our whatever we can, at least we don't cause suffering for ourselves unnecessarily, and we develop our positive qualities, and then we try to be part of the solution with compassion rather than increasing the problem through anger. So, and of course, we need to have not unrealistic expectations, because this is a very strong stimulus. And if we have a very strong habit of doing this cognitive fusion, we shouldn't just think, oh, okay, by tomorrow, I'm not going to see that. I'm not going to see him as a bad person. Maybe that's not going to happen. But the more that we can, in general, distinguish person and behavior, I think the much, much better it's going to be. We will be able to not get completely agitated and upset and suffer ourselves. We'll be able to develop positive quality of compassion, and then we'll be able to start to express that directly or indirectly to resolve some of the issues in the world. I mean, that's all we can do.
I mean, but we can cultivate compassion while he's on jail, right?
And again, we're not saying compassion is accepting negative behavior. So, you know, if someone is behaving illegally, then part of the compassionate action is to take them out of society, if that's the appropriate thing to do, if they're engaging. So we're not saying, you know, don't lock up anyone who's behaving badly. In fact, they're a danger to themselves and society, so we need to have mechanisms to take people who are a danger to themselves and society out of society. But again, unfortunately, our prison system is a punishment system. Bad people, you know, don't we judge people? You're guilty. And so what happens in prisons, we punish people. And statistics show that actually they're more likely to reoffend and be a greater cost to society if we punish people in prisons. Whereas if we try to rehabilitate people in prisons, and of course there's no guarantee we can, but if we try to do that, statistics show lower cost to society. So forget about compassion. If we simply want a lower financial cost to society, don't punish people in prisons. Statistics show that, you know. And there's an interesting case, I think, in Norway some years ago. They adopted this system a little bit. They had a maximum security prison where big crimes, you know, not just minor things. And in this prison, there were no bars on the windows. There was no big fence around the prison. No one tried to escape. Nobody. Because they were being cared for. They could see that people were caring for them. They didn't try to escape. And of course, these very people then often a very positive influence in society, because they go out and they see how their previous negative behavior was a very destructive. And they're often the champions who go out and tell people, please don't do all these criminal activities. Whereas, of course, if you punish them in prison, reinforce that, then of course they'll go out and they're actually even worse. So it's counterproductive. Okay. We've run over time. Oh, little question, then we finish.
Can you pass the microphone to her?
Thank you. In link with that question, so I have a question about like, well, so what are the value? What about the value? Because your value can be really different from the other one value. So then what are the best value? How do you deal with it? How can you say like, this is compassion and or not? And also the thing between like, being compassion, like put people, try to manage things and everything. But you have also a huge difference between what is legal and what is legitimate, which is a really different word, because sometimes things are legal but really really unfair and not like but in the thing for all the people. And by the same way, doing something like legitimate, which is like lead for all the people to have the same right, is not yet legal. So how do you deal with all this kind of behavior?
Yeah. So it's all about values and things being legal or legitimate and so forth. And of course, all countries have various systems of law, which came about through very many historical factors, some good, some not so good. So of course, there are many laws that are not ethical and that they're not equal. And so we as an individual, then we can, again, using wisdom and compassion, we can do whatever we can to try to improve that situation, to get the laws changed and so forth, so they're more equitable, more and more just and so forth. So that's all we can do in terms of this system we have now, is just try to improve it. But again, using anger and so forth, that doesn't help at all. And in terms of values, again, some of the values that we have built up over in generations, some of those are not very helpful. They, in fact, can be harmful. And so, again, you know, at the deepest level, we're trying to, and in Buddhism, one of the core themes is the idea of ethics. And there's not some sort of objective thing out there that says this is right, this is wrong, and so forth. It's really in terms of, does these behaviors help or harm ourselves and others? And so this is all we can do, is use that as the guideline for developing our laws, our values, and so forth. And I think partially that's sort of done in cultures, but partially I think self-interest has come into developing laws, you know, because this law will help me and not those people. And so, you know, all we can do is try to improve those situations. That's all we can do. Yeah. Okay, we've run over time. So just briefly what we're going to be doing tomorrow, and then we'll stop today. So tomorrow morning, we're going to look at attachment, what it is, where does it come from, how to deal with attachment. And then the second session in the morning, we'll look at some short-term strategies in terms of those 6 steps we saw from ignorance down to suffering, how we can then not only reduce our mental afflictions like anger and attachment, but also how to reduce suffering as well. So we'll look at those. And then after lunch, the 2 sessions, we'll be looking at this long-term strategy. How do we really start to overcome anger, attachment, and all mental afflictions through really understanding this Buddhist view of reality, that everything is interdependent, this idea of emptiness. So we'll sort of touch on that. And that's going to be very helpful in also helping us to reduce in the short term as well, things like anger and attachment. So that's all I wanted to talk about today. Let's leave it there. See you tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Thank you.
Sorry? You're staying in Buda? Yeah. No, I'm leaving in Latin Party. Oh, yeah. You're leaving back? Yeah, because... yeah, because